Hello, I am joining you from the Collaborative Courts team at the Administrative Office of the Courts, and today I'm going to share some information that will help your team to have hard conversations about data in your collaborative courts. This video comes as a part of Just Data January 2024, where we're focused at looking at participation in our courts and asking hard questions of our court and each other in order to build a plan for change. So this all comes as part of that effort, and I'll be referencing a little bit of the data collection and information that Washington courts might use in that effort. That being said, you can get all the resources and do this even if it's no longer Just Data January. Feel free to follow along, and hopefully you'll learn a little something about meeting facilitation and preparation. We have a basic agenda here. We're going to start off by talking about preparation of your meetings and what helps set your team up for success in these conversations. While having a spontaneous meeting is less work and more fun sometimes, it may seem as though it even allows more organic development of ideas. It's important to remember that an unplanned meeting tends to rely on unspoken structures that benefit the people who understand them best, the people who this system is built for. So oftentimes this is a challenge, changing those structures, changing those systems, because we're people. So if you'd really like to include and honor a diversity of expertise, you need to prepare a thoughtful meeting that includes and listens to ideas from all of the people at the table. That's all to say that preparation is going to be a big part of what we talk about today. From there, we'll make a meeting plan using norms and communication agreements as an example of how to make that preparation happen in a pretty cohesive way. And then we'll set a stage for smooth conversation during the meeting by talking about what neutral facilitation is, a little about some of the challenges that may come up, and we'll finish up with an exercise that you can use as a final check-in. I'm going to start off with this quote. Shakespeare wrote in Henry V that all things are ready if our minds be so. To me, this means that being prepared for this kind of conversation is in great part ready our minds, our emotions, and our hearts to talk with colleagues about real complex issues that never have an easy solution. For some, this complexity means feeling helpless. For others, it brings up defensiveness or even traumatic memories. As someone coming to this conversation, either as a facilitator or a participant, it's important to come into the conversation recognizing our own needs, our own biases, our own assumptions, and even our hopes. We design the meeting with some reflection, but it isn't enough. The real work is really your openness to rationally and calmly discuss a topic that is very close to your emotions. And that really relies on work outside of the conversation to develop hope, emotional regulation skills, and to engage in reflection on the topics at hand. So again, if your mind is ready, then the meeting will go well. And that goes for everyone on your court team. In less philosophical, more concrete preparation, developing and sharing a clear purpose for the meeting will help to reduce anxiety and help the team to prepare for the topics at hand. The backwards by design approach is a great way to help reach a particular end goal, which starts with setting learning outcomes. I'll walk you through this process using a storyboard, which is just a curriculum design method that educational design uses in order to set a very clear and very specifically organized structure for our meeting so that we know that when we go into it, and also for all the folks who are coming to it, that we have this clarity of purpose set out. So this is just a basic meeting planning board. It's sometimes called a storyboard. I like to call it a meeting planning board because to me, storyboards would have pictures and I tend to not use those. So all this is really doing is breaking down the meeting into concrete chunks that are all guided by their end goal or their learning outcome. If you aren't going to be designing the meeting, you can go ahead and skip this section and move on to slide 10. But for those that are sticking around, I'm going to go through the definitions of each of these components and why they're an important preparation for a tough meeting topic, or really for any topic if you want to have really productive meetings. So the first thing is learning outcomes. My working definition of learning outcomes from the education literature is that a learning outcome is really what everyone should understand or accomplish at the end of the conversation, so the end of this concrete meeting chunk. So we want to think in terms of action verbs. We want to have everyone understand, everyone define, decide, determine, and that helps you to guide what sort of activities that you might do. Most learning used to take place by just presenting information or talking to the audience, but true learning, especially for adults, we know takes place through experiences and connecting our learning to those past experiences. So using discussions or planned activities like liberating structures, which I've referenced here a couple times and will link to in the text, that builds a framework that flattens power dynamics and attaches new concepts to past knowledge. So then we have to think about the why. So we don't want to just pick a learning strategy. We want to really reflect on why are we picking this particular strategy as we're moving forward. In hard conversations, it's really important that everyone in the room has a chance to share and listen. How does the structure that we're using support that? Thoughtful consideration of the how ensures that the learning outcome will be met by using this section of the why. I really encourage you to time limit these discussions or have as many breaks as you can. This allows us to take time to process and keep emotionally regulated, as well as making sure that we're doing those basic things. Have we gotten enough rest? Have we gotten enough food? For some, this is really personal, these conversations, especially when we talk about things like race or gender and the differences between those groups. So being trauma-informed means building rest into the structure so that no one has to ask for it. Make a schedule, but do be flexible when activities run long as your meeting always ends on time. You can always bump an activity to the next time you meet. And then I always leave a tools section just to remember that we might need paper or pens or tablets or other things. We might need a computer. We might not need a computer. You can also just think about what types of people or expertise you might need in the room as well. Do you need to take notes? Do you need to assign someone to do that? So any sort of thing that you need to figure out before the meeting in order to have it move forward. All right, so here's that same meeting planning board, just a little bit bigger, and I'm going to start with an example. Okay, so we can't make changes to our courts if we aren't willing to accept and discuss the problem, even if they're hard to deal with. So we make the strategy that increases safety for participants while not avoiding the topic. We want to start a meeting that sets the stage for participation for the rest of the meeting. So that means you might be tempted to skip a welcome or check-in activity, but don't do it. If you start the way you plan to continue, then it makes the whole process a lot easier. So thinking on this topic of hard conversations, I've identified that in the first few minutes, I really want to level the power dynamics in the room. I want to make sure that everyone's comfortable with talking with the group and make sure that everyone knows the basic rules of this conversation. So what I'm going to say is that my learning outcome is to establish clear group norms and agreements for behaviors and ensure that all participants understand them. So if we don't establish these ground rules, the conversation can and will veer off topic. The temptation to go down the easier path is strong, so we may just end up talking about something entirely different. I'll also take this opportunity to talk to other members of the team because I want to establish that there's a participation dynamic from the very beginning that expects us all to talk and participate. And then I'll fill in those specific activities, the hows, the whys, the times after we get the other learning outcomes decided. All right. Our next learning outcome will focus on helping the group to identify and narrow down the challenge that you want to focus on. So let's say that as a team, you've gathered the data for your drop-off analysis and looked it over, which is part of that Just Data January I referenced earlier. So you've looked at your drop-off analysis, you've gone through that information, and you thought, okay, you know what? We've identified that the area we want to work on is step 9, which focused on the cases that did not enter collaborative court because after looking at your data, you all saw that this is the time point that lost the highest number of potential participants over the last 6 months. So the considerations in these steps, on the right-hand side of the page, if you're looking at your drop-off PDF form, the considerations are things like using parent feedback to discover why parents did or did not enter the program. We might look at subjective entry criteria, especially criteria that could introduce bias like readiness for the program, or if we're using a team vote, and see maybe if that's something that we want to consider changing. We also should talk about if there's a lack of interest or engagement in the court after the referral, and if there's any demographic differences in the parents who decline to enter the program. This last one brings up race, so it's a more difficult topic. So we'll just make sure that we have some planning that reflects that, as well as any areas of potential bias. So considering all of these things that we might want to talk about, and really we should talk about all of them, we want to think about my learning outcome for this section, which is to establish a clear goal for how to make a change within this area of step 9. Okay? So I'm not just saying that we're looking at the data, we're deciding as a group on a change in our policies related to step 9 in our data. So now that we have that decision, we have a rough plan for those first two parts, we need to do a little planning around possible barriers to success. One of these is making sure we have buy-in from all team members. We rarely can expect a unanimous decision on a change, though we can hope. But feeling heard and that your concerns are respected is a big part of building that buy-in. So this section's objective is focused on that, to allow all team members to reflect on their concerns, problem solve, or listen depending on the need. And then finally, we're going to move in to action steps. So before our meeting, we need to establish that this is a team effort and we all need to take part in that work. In my experience, people are willing to do what needs to be done, but they're not always likely to volunteer. There's this thing called the bystander effect that means that someone else will always do the work, right? Much easier to ask someone directly or assign a task directly, while making sure that it's really clear that anyone can say, no, they don't have the capacity for that if that's necessary. So my learning objective here is to assign a task to each team member that moves our change plan forward. And I just want to note here that in our next week of Just Data January, we're going to be talking about goal setting specifically. So really with my thoughts about these learning outcomes, these pieces of homework don't need to be huge. They just have to move you forward to the next meeting. So for one of your task members, you might just say, send out the meeting notes. It might be that you say, here, why don't you do some research on this particular topic that's relevant? Maybe you need to find a survey. Maybe you need to find or make a meeting or ask a research associate from AOC to come and join your meeting. So little things, small things, but making sure that everyone in the group is taking some of the lifting that helps to generate some involvement and also to feel like this is something that they're a part of, that we all have our part to play within this group work. Okay, so back to the agenda. That's the basic step of preparation, and I'm only moving on without that full agenda item formed because I want to go through an entire example plan for norms and agreements, which I have as the welcome section of that first meeting plan. So coming back here, what I put in under our learning outcome to review is that we're going to establish clear group norms and agreements for behaviors and ensure that all participants understand them. We want to spend about 10 minutes each time that we meet on a welcoming activity so that we're giving everyone enough time to get into the right mindset, but we're still leaving time to talk and make progress. So generally speaking, I would say 5 to 10 minutes for a welcome activity, 10 as we're starting, and then you leave about 40 minutes for all the rest of the content. We're talking only about really hard conversations, right? If you're talking about things that are relatively easy, you can make that welcome time shorter, but we want to actually make sure that we have plenty of time to sort of spend in our group space so that we can establish how the group will interact, figure out that we have a little bit of time for thinking on these activities, a little time to talk and share, a little time to flatten the power dynamics by showing through our actions that every person on the team is important in this work. So we're going to go through two options to do this, but first I'm going to define and identify what norms or agreements are. So over here on the left side, I have a little bit of info about norms. I know the slide is going to have a lot of words on it, but basic idea is that norms are the unspoken strategies and assumptions that we use in social interactions. Right? People don't know necessarily what we're thinking internally, but our society does have some basic rules that we almost always follow, or at least some people do. For some people, generally those with higher power or privilege, those that are higher in education, those that come from places where maybe they just had more parental interaction, oftentimes higher socioeconomic class folks, these strategies, norms, they come easily, naturally even. For those who struggle to be heard because they're shy, they're slower to speak, they have lower power, they're less confident, maybe they don't even have English as their first language, norms can make having their voices heard much more difficult. Right? So some norms that I've seen us follow in various court settings. One, the boss or the judge leads the discussion and also tends to talk more than others in the room. In some meetings, this is totally appropriate, but in others, especially where we want to come to common agreements, that isn't appropriate. So we want to make sure that everyone gets a chance approximately equally to talk. Okay. Time is something that comes up really often as a norm. For most groups, we know that starting on time, starting 5 minutes late, starting 5 minutes early, whatever it is, there's just this sort of unspoken rule that this is what we do. Much better for us all to know that from the beginning, because then everyone is on the same page. I used to do some research in Costa Rica, and there's this thing that everyone jokes about called Tico time, which is essentially meaning that, you know, like the bus can come when it comes, right? That's a very different social norm where the bus could come 15 minutes late, 20 minutes late, sometimes even an hour late because the bus driver is going to deal with what they deal with and they get there when they get there. Very different norm from when I went to Germany, and I'm seeing that the bus schedule tends to be really, really, really strict, and it gets a little bit uncomfortable when it's not because everyone expects everything to be on time. Now, I also want to mention that talking about travel, like Costa Rica, Germany, this is also something that's pretty normal if you're in a higher socioeconomic status. Not so much when you're talking to people that might not have that opportunity to travel. So while I'm thinking about all of these things relationally, they're really good things. But in this context, we want to just be thinking about all of the people at the table and how we're making them feel welcome, how we're making them feel like they have an equal say in what we're doing. Okay, so norms, unspoken strategy, generally speaking. On the other side, we have conversation agreements. Now, in some cases, people take on the word norm as conversation agreements. So we are going to decide on our norms. That's essentially what agreements are to me, that we as a group, rather than leaving this unspoken, can decide what will the normal behaviors be in our space. We decide them together, we reinforce them and enforce them all together as well. The group enforces those norms or new conversation agreements. An example of this is make space, take space. So this is just a conversation agreement that we all make to have a balanced conversation. Then we need to be aware of how much space we're taking up. And we need to make sure that we're lifting up the voices of other people who may not get that opportunity. So we have to consider that certain people may want to talk more, but that doesn't give the chance to someone else. So instead, let's say you're online, you could send a message to someone and say, hey, Sam, I know that you had some really good thoughts about this. Would you mind sharing that? Right? It gives them a little bit of an opportunity to know that they're going to be called on, and also to help elevate their voice so that everyone else understands that they have expertise in that area. There's a little link here from the Harvard Women in Tech website that has several others, and there's also a list of those that we'll have up under conversation agreements on the website. So you can find plenty of conversation agreements you can find in the resources. So I'm going to start this and show you exactly how I would run through this. I'd start this time, this meeting, and every single welcoming activity with some reflection. A moment to center yourself in the work and what you want to bring forward. But it's also a chance for neurodiverse folks to get grounded, for anxious or trauma reactive folks to use some regulation skills, and for a learner who needs extra time to understand the concepts that we might be going over, to just get themselves settled, look at any materials that you have, and think over what we're talking about. In this case, our prompt is about conversation strategies, but it can be modified to consider any topic that's relevant to your conversation. I'd also suggest using a physical timer. People tend to go on, or they get kind of in weird time pressure space. And sometimes when you just say, okay, we have 2 to 3 minutes, go ahead and just write, they forget about the awkwardness and they just write. Okay. Remind people that if they struggle with being timed, it's okay if they just use 1 or 2 ideas. Feel free to turn their back to the clock. There's no negative here. It's just to keep us all on time so that we don't spend too much time in reflection and not have time to go through the talking parts of things. Okay, so my first, take a moment to reflect on what conversation strategies make you feel the most heard and valued, and then just list them out as quickly as you can. Second question, so I'm going to give them 2 minutes to do the first one. Now I'm going to give them this new prompt and ask them again, take a minute to think about a specific conversation you've had recently that felt productive. What worked? Again, list as many as quickly as you can. I'm adding this second reflection because being heard isn't always productive, and productivity doesn't always make a team feel valued. But we do have some action items we need to get to, so we want to make sure that we're thinking about both of these things within our reflection time. And then we turn to some assumptions because we want our individual biases just to be in our awareness. And I always tell people on this one, we don't have to share these, but we do have to be aware of these. So because we can make more informed decisions when we remember where our biases are, we're going to write those down on a separate piece of paper. Okay, so now we're going to do 2 different options for liberating structures, right? We have this reflection time for a few minutes, and then we have either 1, 2, 4, all, which is a liberating structure, and then anonymous sharing, which is from a book called Designing Group Work by Elizabeth Cohen. So 1, 2, 4, all, you may have come across this again. We ask our individuals to form into pairs, talk with each other and combine their lists, and I ask them to pick their top 5 items for each question. After they've done that, you give them maybe 3 minutes to do so. Again, we're putting on the time pressure because we don't want this to take all day. We want just 10 minutes. So then we ask that pair to join with another pair. Now we have 4 people. And then combine their list, pick the top 5 items. You have to narrow them down. It's the rule. And then finally, you're going to ask the group for their top ideas, and each group should share only the new or different ideas from the preceding group. So this does mean by the end, the last group probably won't have anything to share, and that's okay. You don't want to end up with a list that's a mile long. Instead, we want to pick the ones that are most important to our specific group. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 4, all in a basic nutshell. Another option is if we're really worried about power dynamics. We know that there are some people who are never able to talk, especially because they know that their boss is in the room, because they know that they're, generally not feeling listened to. Then we could use this other idea. This method shares ideas semi-anonymously, and I say that semi-anonymously because technically you could figure out who said what using handwriting, but that really isn't the point, and it really isn't particularly helpful to move forward. So I really encourage people not to do that. Instead, we're focusing on the ideas that might come out when we're, that might not come out when we're not distracted by whoever holds more power at that table. Whether you're a judge or a court graduate, we all have thoughts that might be the one that teaches us something new. So we're going to do the same thing. We're repeating those reflections, and then we ask them all to put their papers, the first 2, not all 3 of those questions, but those first 2 questions in the center of the table and just mix them up. Everyone takes a new paper and selects the top 5 on this list. You can add something. but only if you're sure that it's critical. So if you see, all this list of things and you know that there's one that's really, really, really important, you can cross off one of their top 5 and instead add one of yours, but you have to make sure it's really important. There's no asking questions in this process. We're ignoring any of the options that don't make sense or repeating, and we're just selecting one of the other ones. There's no judgment in this. We know that when we're brainstorming, we might come up with some weird stuff. That's all right. Clearly number the top items and pass them on. And then if you need to, you might do that again. Then we're going to ask volunteers or write or shout out the top 5 that they saw within those lists, right? So we're talking about ones that aren't the ones we wrote down, but it allows us to have some anonymity within those spaces. Okay, so that means we've done all of this top board. Liberating structures and other group formation activities have a number of different ways for this how to build the conversations. I've actually finished up this meeting storyboard. I've added a copy to the website so you can use or modify for your own needs. In this case, we're just doing 1, 2, 4 all or anonymous sharing. We're thinking about the why, which is anonymous sharing lets us flatten the power. 1, 2, 4 all, make sure those ideas spread throughout the group and that everyone finds them more important before moving them on. We picked a time limit of 10 minutes. The only thing we really need is movable chairs or breakout rooms, depending on whether we're in person or not. So then I went through, I did the same thing with identifying the challenge, perspectives and concerns, action steps, and you can either use mine or you can use another one. Idea from your own information about groups. All right, so during the meeting, let's talk about some of those challenges that may come up. We have neutral facilitation. So coordinators in the courts often play the role of neutral facilitator. Their job is to keep up with documentation and coordination of meetings like these, so it falls naturally into their space. However, a coordinator may also be wearing other hats, like case managing, lived expert, SUD expert, child life expert, or just being a human, which means we have a particular view. And so being neutral on a team can be a challenge. In some cases, it might be best to have someone on the outside of the team play this role if you're really coming up across a lot of difficult issues. But generally speaking, a facilitator is just someone who works with all the group participants to talk with each other and come to mutually satisfactory decisions. Okay, here are a few do's and don'ts that might help you. When we're thinking about a neutral facilitator, so the role that the facilitator of these conversations needs to play, your role is to create a safe place to talk. Right? So that means you're noticing emotional context, you're noticing nonverbal cues, you're helping participants to relax and feel comfortable, thinking about things like breaks, thinking about humor. We're demonstrating that we care about your needs in this conversation. We're demonstrating active listening. So we're reflecting and thinking about what they're saying as they're saying it and playing a role model for good communication by, saying, oh, I hear that what you're saying is whatever. Okay. I help the participants to define the issues in their own way. I'm not trying to put their issues into my words. You're helping them talk about their feelings where appropriate and be respected when they do share those. Helping everyone to be realistic about decisions and whatever the action that they propose is. Intervene when participants break the ground rules. I said that those ground rules or agreements are for everyone to hold forward, and I think that that's very, very important that we're not leaving that just to the facilitator, but it's the facilitator's job to make sure that our agreements are being upheld. So another place you might think about this is that they're reminding the group about their shared purpose. They're reminding the group about their shared values, their mission, and even their court policies and procedures, because those were all decided outside of this meeting. Then that coordinator or neutral facilitator's job is to remind us that, oh, we already talked about this and that's what we've decided is true, okay? What a neutral facilitator can't do and still be neutral is they can't decide who's right and who is wrong. They can't pass judgment, they can't take sides, they can't give advice or tell people what to do. And really, they shouldn't even be the ones to come up with answers to the problem. And I don't want to leave a coordinator out of that conversation. And I think it's really important that we listen to them because they often have a lot of long-term experience. However, if they can't play that role where we're doing a neutral facilitator role, then I think that it's most important to have someone else come in and do that so that they also feel heard. So that's something to consider within your group. And then we also don't want to ask too many why questions. We can summarize, we can clarify, but not asking why, because why has sort of a judgment to it. So instead, we might have to think about some probing questions, some summarization questions. So I think I'm hearing you say that if we make this change, we may actually do the opposite and push away people that we otherwise have brought into the court. And here's why I think so. You might say, what do you think would happen if whatever nervous thing that you're talking about might come up? You might ask, could you clarify? What is the connection between this point and this other point? Or what would help us to resolve this barrier that we're talking about right now? So those are a few ideas. Again, we have some ideas in the notes that I've left, in the resources that I've got on the website, but just thinking about how you can hold that line between the different sides helps to keep that conversation far less tense than it would be otherwise. Having someone that's meant to be attuned to the conversation is important there too. All right, so then common challenges, this is a whole conversation in itself, right? The reality is there are going to be challenges in this work and in these conversations, especially when we have so much passion for changing how things are going. This section has some guidance. There's some resource guidance, but here are some quick tips that we might go through. Sometimes we get stuck, and that stuck might be too much for our meeting, right? So consider adjourning that meeting and just starting with a new strategy. There are lots of different liberating structures, lots of different group participation rules. And so we just might want to consider just getting rid of the one that we're thinking of right then and doing something different, okay? So stop and restart, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, some of the things we should notice as a challenge is coming up so that maybe we catch them before we do is if there's repeating conversations or the sound levels of the meeting have increased or just that feels like there's an emotional charge. Generally, that means that someone's needs are not being met in this meeting. Everyone deserves to have their needs being met. Right? This isn't a long meeting, so we can make that level of attunement with everyone. So things to ask yourself. Have you taken a break lately? Take 15 minutes. Is everyone being heard? One way to deal with that is, let's say you hear someone repeating conversations repeatedly. You might say, you've brought up that topic a few times now. It seems really important to you. Could you try maybe explaining it in a different way so we can all get on the same page? We could also say, we need some time in smaller groups, right? Having a big group conversation tends to ramp up the energy, which can be good, but it also can ramp it up too high, in which case that might be a time to take a quick reflection break. It might be time to add a breakout topic or go back to pairs of 2 or 4. And then the last one, going back to those agreements. I know you feel really passionate about this, but I just want to go back to our agreements and make sure that we're all making space and taking space and thinking about who needs to take up that space. Okay, so common challenges, so many different things that we can think about there, but basic, easy, this is a professional environment. Most people can stay professional within it. These are just some of the most common challenges when we're having difficulty making a conversation happen. Okay. Now, this is one other liberating structure. And again, I've already given you a couple of them with 1, 2, 4, all with anonymous sharing. This one's called What, So What, Now What? And it's really a check-in activity that you could do maybe a few weeks to a month after implementing a change. I'd start with a welcome activity or check-in, something very simple like asking folks about something that has really invigorated them in their work for the last week. All right, there's lots of different things that you could ask, but just ask everyone to share something that brings them to an emotional and sort of focus level in the whole group. And then we ask the group what. So we're going to spend some time just doing that 1, 2, 4 all or 1, 2 all this case. Spend 1 minute alone and writing down anything you noticed or observed after that change in policy that you made. You've had about a month to think about it. Did anything stand out? Right? Did you notice any difference in participants? Did you notice any difference in the ways that folks were coming into the court? If you were one of the people on the ground doing the work, are there things that you noticed about them, right? You're going to ask a recorder to take notes. You're going to split into small groups. Most of your court teams could just do this as one large group right away. But if you have maybe more than, I'd say 8 people, I'd split into 2 small groups and then a bigger group. So just try to keep it in relatively small groups so we can have that time for everyone to talk, just like we did in the first meeting. And then the next stage is discuss what we noticed, so what we observed. We're going to move on to a little bit of analysis of that. We're not trying to jump to conclusions, but we also have to notice changes, see if we need to do any shifting in what we're working on right away, right? We need to be implementing these things as soon as we can. This is particularly important too if there's data that we aren't gathering, but as we look at our observations, it's really clear that we might want that data to show that our change is working in order to implement a bigger change in the future. So thinking about what we noticed, why it's important, what patterns we might see, what hypotheses we can make. Again, 1 minute alone, so reflection time by yourself, 2 to 7 minutes in small groups. If the group is very large, then you might have 2 small groups and then a large group to share all your points out. Again, ask a recorder to take notes. The product of this meeting is those notes. So we need to make sure that we're keeping track of them and using them moving forward. All right, and then we have now what? The final answer might be that we need to hold course, that what we've done is working. We might need to stick with it a little longer. We might need to hit harder. We need to add additional resources. It might be that things are going wrong and something we didn't even consider is coming up. So we should consider that there's options there for what the now what is and make sure we have reflection to see that we're heading in the right direction. So have everyone spend some time coming up with actions, if there are any that make sense, and really just reflect on what could work, what couldn't work. It gives us some time to think of new activities we might try in the next round of changes as well. And so this is a good opportunity, that now what activity, to do that. All right, so that's all I have for today. I've already had your time for about 40 minutes, so I just want to tell you good luck and carry on communicating. We really appreciate you taking part in Just Data January 2024. Please let us know if you have any questions, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.